Hi, everyone. So in the previous class, we talked about the expansion of the Ottomans into the Arab lands. That was all under Sultan Selim. He didn't last very long. He died, I believe, of an illness after 8 years in power. So in 1520, his son Suleiman took over. Had Selim lived, he would have overseen a massive military expansion of the territory of the Ottoman Empire. And in fact, that's what we see under Suleiman in many ways. It's during his reign between 1520 and 1566, so a very long 46 years of rule, that we see both massive military expansion, essentially as far as it is possible for the Ottoman Empire to expand logistically, and the interaction, or at least the embroilment of the Ottoman Empire in a series of proxy wars around the globe into places as far away as Southeast Asia and possibly sub-Saharan Africa. The Ottomans become seen now no longer as a local power with frontier raiders attacking communities in the Balkans or on the edges of what's today Italy and Austria, but as kind of a gigantic worldwide empire that is vying for power against other worldwide empires, and specifically that of Charles V, the Habsburg emperor. So let's look at what the Ottoman Empire was. So at this point, we can see kind of by the 16th century, what ends up trying to, let's say, containing Ottoman territories is this area shaded in pink. Remember, the Ottoman Empire started over here, expanded here, and then into the Balkans and Anatolia. And then during the reign of Suleiman, basically expanded across North Africa, even though these were vassals or places that were indirectly ruled by the Ottomans. And the same also much further into Hungary. Hungary becomes an Ottoman province into essentially today southern Russia. And there's even an attempt, as you can see here, there was an attempt to connect the Don and the Volga through a canal so they could move into the Caspian Sea more easily, ultimately because rivers are much more easier to navigate and to move people than overland, as always. And here on the other side were three other major empires that saw themselves as contemporaries and at times rivals to the Ottoman. Over here is the other major one, the Mughals, who started in the early 1500s and were able to expand, take over northern India. They started with the movement from actually Central Asia into northern India and then expanding, even taking over ultimately in the 17th century, what's called the Deccan, so kind of South Central India. And here in the purple, we have the Safavid Empire. This part is the Uzbek states, which was a rival with the Safavids and on occasion an Ottoman ally. But this was really kind of at the edge of Ottoman control. One of the things we can see here in this map is that the capacity for the Ottoman army or Ottoman government to project direct power was essentially limited to almost a circle of 1,000 kilometers in diameter. So if you could start it from the center would be Constantinople and draw a circle of 1,000 kilometers diameter, that's where you would be able to technically rule. So that means areas like this, Baghdad was kind of the outer limits. Afterwards, it was, and also Vienna, Budapest was very difficult to conquer beyond that, partially just because of logistics. There was a campaign season, which started in late spring when the armies would gather, and then they would march out from Constantinople towards Vienna or towards Tabriz or towards Baghdad. By the time they arrived in Vienna, for example, Vienna was a city that they never conquered. They tried multiple times over the 16th century and 17th century. They would arrive in August. They had about a month of fighting. They couldn't do protracted sieges of the city. And then by mid-September, late September, the weather started turning. By October, it would probably start snowing. So they had to kind of break the siege. So they weren't able to really conquer much further beyond that just because of logistic reasons. The same goes for expanding beyond the Red Sea or Persian Gulf. To do this, you would need naval power. The problem is here, there's no trees. So to bring trees to build ships, you had to cut them off, cut them in Anatolia, ship them over here, take them overland into the Red Sea, and then build the ships on the coast of the Red Sea and sail them. So it was a massive undertaking, much more difficult than controlling the Mediterranean or the Black Sea. That said, they still managed to expand into Yemen and even the Horn of Africa briefly in the 16th century. So part of the reason why they were all these different empires were expanding, and really we can see here, this is the age of early modern empires. We have three rival empires, and we can add here the Holy Roman, or rather the Habsburg Empire, which controlled Central Europe and Iberia, and of course the Americas. The reason why they're vying with each other for global expansion is because the idea of the globe itself was new. After all, the world had been circumnavigated in the early 16th century by Magellan. And at that point, I mean, everyone knew that the world was round beforehand, right? It's not like before Columbus, people didn't know that the world was round. But they understood that the globe was actually a finite object, and that it was actually possible for one person, or at least one empire, to control it all, hypothetically. So the idea of global conquest, of conquering the entire world, becomes widespread, as you can see, even in these Mughal images. This is the Mughal Empire, Jahangir. Even the name Jahangir, Jahan is world, Gir is take, conquer. So the world conqueror is here. He's always standing on a globe. Again, these globes are European made, but the idea that these globes exist and that the world can be seen on a globe and therefore controlled permeates imagery at this time. Here he's shooting at different things, different evil things. Here he's shooting an arrow through the Ethiopian general in the Deccan state, I think Ahmad Negar, that he had conquered. And here's actually embracing the Safavid Shah when in their sort of alliance. Now, besides the fight between all these different global empires, there's other types of empires, one of which was the Portuguese, which we talked about. They basically had a sort of, let me see, here's the Portuguese overseas empire. They did not have massive land holdings. They were essentially a maritime empire that was based off of controlling the Indian Ocean, and basically built all these forts along different key paths in the northern and eastern Indian Ocean. You can see also here how they controlled the Moluccas and parts of what is essentially Indonesia today, but also the East African coast and the parts of the West African coast. And as I pointed out before, the Portuguese attempted to monopolize sea power and trade by forcing everyone to pay them tribute, while they themselves also were bringing spices and other luxury goods back to Europe via the sea, therefore bypassing the traditional way, which is to go up through the Red Sea, move it overland through Cairo, unload it in Alexandria, and then with Italian merchants ship it to Europe. Now, as I pointed out, the Portuguese were quite vicious and quite combative. In 1517, the year that the Ottomans take over the Mamluks, they were already attacking Jeddah. And so the Ottomans were pushed to mobilize against them. In fact, that was the reason why they had conquered the Mamluk Empire that had controlled these areas before. Right away, there was a push in between the 1520s to the 1560s to set out and try to control the Red Sea in the Indian Ocean from the Portuguese. And this is depicted in both Portuguese and Ottoman miniatures illustrations. So here we have the Admiral Kurdolu Hizr Reis chasing off a Portuguese squadron. Here, the Portuguese ships are fighting the Ottomans. If you notice, the Ottomans are usually in these galleys versus the Portuguese, which are on, I don't know what you call caravels, basically ships running with wind power. Why is that? Ottomans always preferred using galleys, which were pushed by rowers, because it allowed greater flexibility, more movement, more nimbleness in naval battles. And this was often the case in the Mediterranean, where the wind was less reliant or dependable. Ultimately, though, the Ottomans were not able to really project sea power into the Indian Ocean on a massive scale, and that's because they weren't able to build enough ships. There just wasn't significant resources of timber in the Indian Ocean area, so they were able to control this area. This is all desert, essentially, and the same here. This is all lowlands. Timber was very expensive, more expensive than probably any other building material in Egypt and in these places. And it had to be brought from Anatolia, or lesser from Syria, and shipped over. So that made it difficult for them to do anything. Perhaps if they had expanded more, if they had better connections in India or something, they were able to build a navy there, but they didn't have that capacity. And therefore, they were never able to engage deeply with the Portuguese directly. Instead, what they ended up doing is engaging in a variety of proxy battles with the Portuguese by trying to prop up different enemies and rebellions against the Portuguese. So here you can see the Ottoman holdings in around between 1517 and 1589 of the Ottomans. So basically the East African coast, this bit of Yemeni coast, and a bit of what's today essentially Bahrain. So they had some Persian Gulf, some Red Sea holdings here, and they extended their reign to Basra. But they were never really able to, for example, conquer all of Yemen, or to control it easily, or the East African coast, or to extend themselves into this area. And so there were actually numerous battles with the Portuguese, as you can see in this map. There was battles across the Red Sea, across the Hadrami coast here, in different parts in view. This is where the original battle between the Mamluk and the Gujaratis and the Portuguese happened before the Ottomans came onto the scene. And there's another one, 1546. There's numerous battles at different places, even one in Malacca over here, though I'm not sure how massive this was. But upon failing to do that, the Ottomans still had prestige as the premier Islamic empire and the premier enemy of the European powers in the Mediterranean, and had just conquered the Mamluks and were continuously expanding. And so numerous polities in the world turned to them for help, asking for artillery, for cannons, for military advisors, and for financial support. And so in some of these places we have, as this map shows, places where the Ottomans were not ruling, but the name of the Ottoman Sultan was read out during the Friday sermon. And that's the usual sign of sovereignty, but it shows a sort of allegiance, even if symbolic, to Ottoman power. So they're Aceh, which was always the most difficult and independent sultanate in the Malay world, fought very viciously against and valiantly against the Portuguese. And then there was different ways, different kingdoms here that were allying with the Ottomans in different ends. And there were various ways. Ultimately, after the 16th century, so starting in the 1600s, a new power comes into the Indian Ocean, and that is the Dutch. The Dutch were even more vicious than the Portuguese. They were even more militant, and just whereas the Portuguese were happy to take tribute from people in exchange for trading rights, the Dutch just fired on every ship and tried to monopolize all trade in the Indian Ocean. They turned the population of different islands here into slaves to grow spices, and were at that point the Ottomans had already retreated from trying to control the Indian Ocean world, so they were no longer fighting with the Dutch directly. The Ottomans, by the way, also knew about the discoveries of the Americas. This is sometimes depicted in a history of the Americas called in which sometimes is even illustrated. And this, you can see in this drawing a picture of European explorers coming across this new world with all sorts of marvelous animals and hills made out of crystals, etc. But closer to shore, the Ottomans never were as interested in massive naval expansion, or at least unable to logistically, as, for example, the Spanish and the Portuguese, which were at the end of the European peninsula and not hemmed in by the Mediterranean. And so the most of the efforts were actually spent fighting and expanding the empire territorially towards Hungary. And this Sultan Suleiman does very quickly in 1526, so before all the Indian Ocean stuff even. At the Battle of Mohacs, he completely destroys the Hungarian army, which is based off of, again, knights marching on horses, heavily armored, and in the face of cannons and arquebuses, they are completely destroyed. The Hungarians collapse, and Buda, the capital of Hungary, is taken in 1541 after a siege. And Buda becomes an Ottoman holding for the next 100 years or so, 150 years. At the same time, the Ottomans are also expanding heavily into the Mediterranean. There's a variety of proxy wars and fights between the Ottomans and the Habsburgs. At a certain point, the Habsburgs are invading Tunisia. And at this point, the pirate general, Barbarossa, kind of offers his services as an admiral and his fleet in the name of the Ottomans. In doing so, is able to kind of beat back the Habsburgs from invading Tunisia. And there, after that point, Tunisia, Algeria, and Libya become a sort of Ottoman ally, technically part of the Ottoman Empire, but never directly ruled. That said, the Ottomans have a major military setback at the Battle of Lepanto in 1571, where their entire navy is destroyed by a combined fleet of different European Christian armies, Christian navies. And this victory for the Christians, or for the Europeans, is so major that it gets commemorated and depicted throughout churches and spaces all over the Mediterranean. And we can see, if you go to Italy on the Adriatic coast, where close to where the battle is fought, many churches have depictions of the naval battle. There's Turkish flags or Ottoman flags that have been captured and turned into relics for the battle. And we can see just how massive it was. That said, the Ottomans were on occasion allying with different groups. So they allied with the French against the Habsburgs. They allied in different ways at different times. The Ottoman Navy summered off of the French coast, wintered off the French coast because they had an alliance with the King of France, who was trying to fight the Habsburgs himself. At the same time, they're also expanding into essentially southern Russia and into, at a certain point, even invading Poland. And this brought them into interaction with a new enemy, an enemy that would be the major enemy in the 1700s, which is Muscovy, which eventually become known as Russia. If we were to look at Russian noblemen in the 17th century, you'd see that actually they basically dressed like the Ottomans. They're dressed as Central Asian nomads, right? These kaftans and heavy silk brocades. This is brought in from Iran, so forth. If you were to look at the thrones that were being built, or at least gifted to them by prominent Armenian merchants and others, they're based off of kind of Islamicate type of styles. This changes in the 18th century as Peter the Great and Catherine the Great come and kind of turn the Russian Empire away from, or Muscovy away from a focus on Central Asia and Iran and towards Europe. But that's for a later lesson. By the way, you can see actually just how Muscovy starts here, is expanding here, but by the 1533 is, basically controlling this area, and this is what's bringing it into interaction with the Ottomans as it engages with them in the Caucasus. Until next time, bye.